Okay, so the next cut we're going to make is the trickle vent cut. So I've got a small trickle vent here. I'm not sure what vents Mark's going to use for this window, so I'm going to cut a small one in, and then it can be opened up to a bigger one if needs be in the future. So I use an aluminium grill like this, just a simple flat profile aluminium grill, and I sit that in the rebate of the window and recess it in up here, so it's got access to the outside air through the gap in the top of the casement and frame, so the air can flow through there, but you don't see it from the outside, so it's a nice clean finish outside. You've not got an ugly vent canopy sitting on that face of the window. If I'm just putting one in and it doesn't need the ventilation, or there's enough ventilation with just one grill, I'll centre it up, and so it runs through that top joint and just sits in the centre of the window, and then house that back through to the inside of the window and put the trickle vent grill on the centre again on the inside. If we're not going to achieve the ventilation with just one grill, you're either going to need to put two in, or a really big trickle vent grill. Some of the spec sizes that they come out with for trickle ventilation is ridiculous. The surface area of the vent, it'd be like, you might as well just leave the window open. So you need to have a look at your regs and what you want, but if you're building a window for, you know, an old property or your shed or something like that, just any sort of trickle vent, it's ideal to have something in there, in my opinion, because it's nice to have that little bit of ventilation in a sealed room, but you don't want to go too mad and have a huge hole. So I'm going to work with these vents that I've got here. They're 380mm vents is what they're classed as. So we'll get to work and start machining them in place. Okay, so working from the centre of the window here, I'm just going to measure the trickle vent and then give it a little bit of wiggle room, so you don't want to be too tight, and then just going to measure out halfway from the centre of this window. I'll square them lines across so I can see them nicely. So that will be the half-inch slot or 12mm slot, full length, to suit that trickle vent. Now I'm going to rebate this, or slot this down through the almost through the entirety of the head until it meets the vent position or the grill position on the other side. So I'm going to house this grill in just behind the between the drip groove and the mortise, so in that position there somewhere. So we need to make it so that slot will go deep enough to meet that vent position there. So that's our mortise depth. Because with mortise in that deep, we need to make it so it misses this rebate here. So we don't want the slot position to be too close to this edge, that when we mortise through, it's seen here in this timber and cuts away the rebate here. So we need about at least 4mm left on this timber here from that point. So we know the rebate is 15mm deep, so plus 4 is 19. You've got to work quite tightly to the tolerances here, because the higher you go on the head with this vent, the nearer your plaster work you're getting. So when the plaster is when the plasterboard comes back in the reveal to meet the window, sort of like if this was a piece of plasterboard like this, the nearer or the higher you're raising that vent grill, the more likely you are to lose it into the plasterwork, and it's not going to work then. It's going to be sat in the way. So we want to keep it as low down in the window as we can, obviously without coming into this rebate. So I'm going to set it at 20mm. So we've got a nice 5mm thickness on that on that timber under the vent grill, and it's not too high in the window that we're going to lose it in the plasterwork. If you're doing it with a router or you're not confident about getting that cut perfectly square, take it just a tiny bit more, perhaps go 22mm, something like that. As long as you're not in that plaster line, you can sort of work out where that's going to be and raise it up to suit. Tell you what, let's do it 22mm, and then we know we're going to be confident that we can replicate that on the other windows without any problems. So we can of course set up a mortise gauge if we want to show where them lines are going to go. I'll set that to 12mm. Put that on a mark. And then we're mortising all the way along these lines here. Put a pencil line in them. It's not particularly good practice to put a pencil line in your gauge marks because it makes them appear wider. But for the camera there, you can see where that mortise has got to go. So the full length mortise is only going to be the depth of the slot there on the vent that needs to sit in the window, plus a bit more. So we're looking at around 13mm on this one. So if we go 15-16mm deep with that full length mortise, and after that we don't want to mortise that whole section all the way through into the window, because we're going to lose a lot of strength in that piece of timber, and potentially, you know, see something break or have a distortion over time. So especially through this joint here, you won't be able to get a nice secure strong joint there and screw through the top if all that's been mortised away. So we'll just set out a couple of lines in the top here, either side of this joint. So we'll go 20mm either side and put another square line on there. Just label them. So we'll mortise through the outside two parts, so from the end of the vent to here, all the way down to that vent grill on the face, or on the rebate, and then in that centre section we're just going with enough depth to clear the vent, so the vent will sit in the window, and then it will leave enough strength for the fixings through there in that joint to leave the window nice and strong. The bigger the vent, the more sort of strength sections you might need to leave in, but it's good practice to leave something in there, some sort of strength in that wood. As we move around to the rebate, we've got this vent grill, so we're going to need to set out some gauge lines for that, where it's going to go, and centralise it again. To house this vent grill in, just marked from the centre or from this mortise out either way the total length of this vent. So the vent is 383 and we've got a mortise width of 28. So if we take the mortise width off and then halve that measurement, that's our measurement out each side from the edges of the mortise. We can just check them lines against the actual grill and then square them over. Now I use a router jig to position this grill, so I'm not going to physically mark any gauge lines on in case it differs from what the jig's going to cut in place. So I'll set a 15mm piece of timber on here for my jig, so it's the same as the rebate or higher. You can go slightly higher if you want. And then I've just got a flush trim round cutter to machine that vent out. Okay, so just run through a quick mortiser setup. I've got to change the chisel to cut this vent groove in the head to a 1/2 inch chisel. So just going to swap it out. The chisel setup in the mortise is quite important. Got to get it nice and square to the fence, and you've also got to get the cutting piece, the correct height down from the actual mortise chisel itself, so that it doesn't burn the timber and it doesn't snap the bit as well. So there's a sort of a tolerance there as to if it's sticking out too far, it's more prone to snapping the bit, and if it's too close into the chisel itself, then it's going to cause burning and it's not going to cut very efficiently. There's something going on there. There's a bit of a bear on this. We slip in there a treat. There we go, look. So I normally just pop the actual chisel in, push it completely up into its housing, and just clamp it sort of somewhere way off square. I always eject the chips to the right of the machine. I see some people eject it out the back, some front, some left. Doesn't particularly make any difference. I just like to throw it to the right, and then when I clean through the mortise, it chucks it all onto the timber. And as you move the timber out of the way, generally it takes the chips with it and doesn't leave a pile next to where you need to place your next bit of wood. So that's just why I do it that way. So I just clamp the bit as high as it will go into the machine, so it's in the correct setting, and then tighten the drill bit up. So everything's held now, sort of nice and securely out the way. So now that everything's clamped in place, I'll just drop the chisel down so it's in line with the fence or just below. And I've got a little special engineer's square that I keep in with the mortise tooling, and I'll just loosen that chisel off and square it up to the fence, so that we know that our cuts are nice and square, and we're going to get a parallel mortise through the piece of timber. Now you want to get this right from the off with your chisel, because the grub screw will actually indent into the chisel, and if you get it slightly wrong, you're going to have to file that away to get a new seating point for that grub screw, because generally it's going to seat back into the same position every time. So pay attention and be careful on that first sort of tightening where you're going to make that indent, because it's going to last. So we've got a nice square chisel now, and we'll just have a look at the bit depth. So as it stands at the minute, the auger bit that's in the middle of the chisel there is right up as high as it will go, so that there's a surface there that is touching the inside of the chisel. That's not ideal, because if you get a chip or anything in there, it's just going to burn, it's not going to clear it. There's no clearance there for the wood chips to go through. It's just going to sit in there and clog up, so you'll find that it'll be really hard to push through the timber and it won't eject the chips properly. So what we're looking for is just to drop that down about 2.5 to 3 mil. So we'll drop it down 2 mil, and it's just sort of in line with the points on this 1/2 inch chisel. It's a bit different depending on the size of the chisel, how much you drop it down. Smaller chisels, you're obviously going to drop it down just a touch less so that you've got smaller chips. What you don't want to do is drop that chisel out the bottom of the bit, so that it's sort of running a bit too free for what it should be, and it's going to cut really big chips and try and feed them up through this chisel and end up splitting the edge of the chisel there. So that's about the perfect setting. It shouldn't make any noise really when it's running. It might make some noise if something's out of a line, if you're using an old style mortiser. So on mine here I've got a chuck, a Jacob's chuck on here. Whereas some styles of mortises have a sleeve and then you put a grub screw in. You might find that they make a bit of noise as they're working because it's just ever so slightly pinching it off centre, or the bit isn't quite the right fit for the collet. It'll just be moving in sort of a circular motion instead of perfectly true. There's not really a lot you can do about that, but you want it to sound so like it's not making any noise at all when you're not cutting. One thing about a Jacob style chuck, when you're setting that height of that bit in the machine, when you're setting this depth of the auger bit or the cutting bit, as it clamps a Jacob style chuck, the jaws are actually moving out, so just be aware that when you tighten that up, it's going to add a bit more of a protrusion on that bit, so always err on the side of caution. You don't want it to stick out too much once it's been tightened up. I've just got a little cupboard here that brother made years ago actually. It's got all the different mortise bits inside it, some cleaning kit, square, and everything you need to adjust the machine, all contained right next to the mortise. Right, so we're going to mortise from the inside of the window. I'm just going to clamp the piece in this way round. I might not make it with this setting on the clamp. Oh yeah, just. I'm going to set the depth of the cut against the fence in this plane so that it's not going to appear in that rebate. There we go. So when we turn that over and mortise from the other side, we know we're not going to see the chisel appear through and make a mess of that rebate. And we're just going to follow our setting out that we've already done. I'm just going to put a 15mm packer in there to stop me damaging that edge where the draft strip sits, and it's been cut away and it's quite brittle, so the clamp will act on the actual rebate. So the depth of the cut for this trickle vent, I've marked the grill position on here, so we just want to reach it into that grill position, and then when we router the centre of that vent grill, we can router into this cut, and we've got a nice clear hole through the head. I was going to call it a cylinder head then. So that's our depth for our physical cut, but we also need to do a full width depth cut to sit that vent in. So I'm going to set that around there. It looks about 15mm. On this machine I have to set that first, so that's called a haunch depth stop. So we'll set that one, and then the other depth is adjusted on the grub screw here. So we'll do that. We'll drop the chisel down to where we want it to go to, and then we'll lock this one off nice and tight. So it's that haunch depth, so the 15, 16mm, whatever you set it to clear the vent all the way along, and then we're going full depth in them two outer sections. Just got to move this clamp because it's run out of travel. You notice I've put a false bed on the mortiser here. It's just a case of if your depth stop slips when you're mortising anything that's a bit thinner and it goes through the material, it's not going to knacker your mortise chisel up. It's going to go into this. You'll feel it and see it go through the bit of wood because it'll make all sorts of different noises and move a little bit. But you won't be going into steel, you'll be going into this sacrificial bed, so I'd advise you put one of them on as well. Right, so let's start again. A bit clamped down this time. There we have it, our vent sits nicely in that groove. So that travels through to the rebate. We can now do our mortise here to intercept it with the vent grill. So I've got my vent grill jig. You can make this, I use a router cutter. It's a top bearing flush trim bit like this, so I've made the jig to the same size as the actual grills, and then use this router to let them in. This wants to be the same thickness as the rebate or taller, so that the router isn't affected by that rebate that it's sitting in and hitting this piece of timber. So I've just got a piece here to pack it off against that rebate to keep it nice and parallel. I'm going to align it with the two lines that are already marked on there for centre, and then clamp it in place. You just need to set the depth to about 3mm, and then router that out. Use a nice sharp chisel to just square them corners up. You can use the jig as a guide if you've still got it clamped. And then the grill will just fit nicely in that housing. It's a tiny bit tight on this one, but I found these aluminium grills do vary quite a lot in their sizes, so I'd order these before you start cutting them and make sure that they're going to fit the length of the housing that you're going to do. So the only thing left to do now is to house down from this vent grill into that mortise that we did from the inside of the window. So I'm going to set up a 1/2 inch router and plunge that through using that. Again, we're going to need a 15mm packer piece on this front edge so that the router can rest between the rebate and this piece of timber without tipping into that rebate. Now for that I usually use a bead like this, because I finish my beads 15mm, it's quite handy, and I just clamp that in place on the ends, well out of the way of the router. So we're just going to centralise this cutter in that housing that we've already made. fence is. So the fence wants to run against the head of the window and not this piece. So this piece has got to sit nicely in from the edge and away from this cut as well. Then we can set the depth too. So that's our housing depth at 27, and we want about 12mm for the mortise, and then probably 3mm of timber until we get to that mortise. So 15mm from 27. That's 42. We'll lock that off and we'll plunge it to that depth. Now the vent grill that I use has a bit of a blank section on the end. I'd just mark that on and make sure you don't mortise that bit out, so you've got a bit of strength left for these fixing points. And you can do the same in the middle, so I'd just, where the visible line of the mortise is, I'd just square that line over or tick it and just make sure that the router goes just past that line, so the centre of the bit is in line with that mortise, so that it looks like the groove goes fully through, but then leave the centre section of that timber whole, so there is a bit of meat there. And the same at the other end as well. Looks like I could do with a new router bit in there. We'll have to get rid of that one. Just clean these up quickly. We've got a lovely clean cut on every part of the vent grill there. If we'd have cut the vent in the rebate first and housed that section out, when we mortised down from the other side, it would break out all this edge on this timber. So you've got to do the mortise side first. Even if you're using a router, this bit is quite thin, especially where it's been housed out. And the router, if you get any sort of catch or pull on the timber, it's just going to make a mess of this edge. So that's the best way around to do it, is mortise first and then break into that mortise from the rebate. And once the window's assembled, you get a lovely vent grill finish that looks like when the joint's there, it goes right through the window, but you've still got a nice strong window that you can screw together through this joint because it's still all solid. It's a fair bit of work doing this extra slot here, but it does make for a nice looking window on the outside. The simple option is just to have a straight through mortise, so you'd mortise from this edge as well as on the inside and just meet the two together, but make sure you leave that section of strength in there. Don't just do a complete slot all the way through the window. And like I did say before, you could have a grille in each side, so in each casement to make that airflow up if it's needed.